Hello, everyone. This is Professor Michael Pelias with a special attempt, if you will, to present the work of Dave Zirin for the Sociology of Sport class and also for general ways of writing history differently, which Zirin is the leading exemplar, exemplary work by Dave Zirin in this domain. So I want to mention that very much about Dave Zirin. As I mentioned in class, his Edge of Sports, on the Edge of Sports blog is one of the best moments out there. He's also a sports editor for The Nation magazine, a weekly that comes out, and has brought on many talk shows at times, especially on the YouTube channels and other alternative media sources. He's not an ESPN regular, but anyway, the reason is that he's a radical. He just does sports differently. So anyway, I want to get to the book. We're reading the people's history of sports in the USA, even though USA is not completely accurate here because it is an internationalist context of which Zirin is addressing. The book is, a compendium, in my opinion, of events and figures in the history of sports that are placed in the historical political context into which they emerged, and the figures and so-called and the events as a way of writing history differently. We usually just look at statistics, how good someone is, how great they were, rather than trying to understand this work as athletes in terms of their historical political context and the sociological effects they may have. So I want to remind everybody about the necessity of thinking through sports sociologically, philosophically, and of course, historically. And from that, I think we glean a much more in-depth analysis of the role of sports in our general society, the role sports plays in our everyday life, and how sports can be used to enhance and enrich our understanding of our moment here in history in the early 21st century. So I look forward to, introducing you to the book in a couple of minutes. Again, Dave Zirin is an extremely gifted writer. Some of his other books are What's My Name, Fool? A study of Muhammad Ali. He wrote a book on the John Carlos story, of whom, as you remember, was one of the sprinters who raised his fist with a black glove on it to signify black power during the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. Zirin has also done a lot of work on gentrification in terms of downtown sports arenas and how this has contributed to displacing people, and at the same time been part of a quote, financial and renaissance of some downtrodden areas around. And we'll speak about that later, and maybe in another video towards the end of the semester. Anyway, I want to go through the context and the contents of the book. The first chapter, Until the 20th Century, kind of sets the framework. It begins with the Choctaw tribe and their beginnings, dances and celebrations before going to play lacrosse. So most people don't really understand that Native Americans, right, are natives, since today is Indigenous Peoples Day. It's really the beginning of sports in the United States. And the Choctaw tribe went out and played in this beginning. Their primary purpose, as Zirin reminds us, was fun, to have fun. It was not done in the context of, the big money or whatever, but it was also community training that was oriented towards both agriculture and military skills. So sports had a very early connection to the land and agriculture, as well as a connection to the military. And we're going to speak a little bit about that as well, because he goes on into this end of this chapter, the first chapter, into until the 20th century, to speak about muscular Christianity and that sports as a preparation for young men for war. And this is very, very important to keep in mind. Anyway, early on, he in chapter 1 until the 20th century, Zirin juxtaposes King James of England loving his sports going back to 1618. So this is juxtaposed to the indigenous or the Choctaw tribe, celebrations before the games. And this is where the sports really was American sports as being preparing young men for war. He repeats this on page 5 in the edition we're using, Dwight Eisenhower's dictum, the president of the United States from 52 until 1960. And this is very interesting, the work of the King James, etc., and sports as the importance, in the terms that it was always a release from the work week, another effect of sports, what it's about. Then, of course, we begin, and we have talked about this as well, the plantation analogy. Zirin will revisit, if you will, what Harry Edwards pointed out so beautifully in The Revolt of the Black Athlete about the dirty South, right, and Puritanism and sports in bondage, and in a sense, the hegemony of plantation life and how this continued in sports very actively. And the next chapter, again, he's just introducing us to the historical parameters of his work. That the founding fathers, in terms of what they brought out here, is that the sports was necessary for order, for keeping people distracted. Very interesting too. And what was always done in this distraction and this emphasis upon the sports was the caveat that this should not be a place for fraternization of Black slaves and the white poor. And this is a very important remark that he makes that could be turned into an excellent term paper. How is it that people that are gifted in sports, Black and white poor, are not supposed to fraternize, and that this was somewhat threatening to the status quo and to the system as well, right? Yeah, so they separate, and Frederick Douglass said, separate both the working poor and the working white poor from that of the Black, right? The Black slaves, in order to separate both of them in order to conquer them. So the old divide and conquer mentality starts. And this is where we probably get some of the cracker, mentality, how that divides and how that divisiveness was born and in terms of sports, right, etc. So this is very important too. Then he goes on to women. So he's going to take up, again, the cause of women and women on the sidelines. And this is something we'll return to in terms of gender and gender studies, right? And he goes through Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton, and very interesting, excuse me, that women's right to physical play was essential and inextricable from citizenship. And this is, again, a very important part of the early chapter here. Again, the plantocracy, its relationship to sports, right? Of course, before that, the Choctaw Indians and their celebrations before lacrosse games, how King James and others, particularly the framers of the Constitution and afterwards in the 19th century and through the 20th century, saw sports as a form of control and did not want any kind of massive fraternization between, again, the white poor and the Black slaves, or really in the Black players, right? So this is a very important part, again, and then women, who was on the sidelines for a long time. So anyway, we will talk more about this, of course, in our classroom activities, but he mentions a term that's going to be crucial for us going forward, and I think something that still plays out in the sports world today. That is the concept of muscular Christianity. He calls this an ethos, a new ethos, right? That begins to become the motto or the mantra, if you will, of sports, right? In a sense, right? Muscular Christianity took on many different levels. One level was, interestingly, went into the John Brown raid on Harper's Ferry and played out an abolitionist. In another way, the muscular Christianity also played out in terms of building men for war. Once again, the new model, right? And as the athletes, right, would be under the moral guidance of the Republic. Therefore, good sports, which teach obedience to authority, values, godliness, and always toughen up, etc., versus the bad sports known as rat baiting and cockfighting as well. So this new ethos was created, and he picks this up once again, just to move forward a little bit, into the Teddy Roosevelt's model of muscular Christianity in the second chapter. All right. So anyway, one other moment of the first chapter, very, very important, is the role of Moses Fleetwood Walker. And this is, again, one of Zirin's chief gifts, I think, being able to bring figures out of obscurity and show their relevance. So really, in a way, Moses Fleetwood Walker was one of the great baseball players, completely forgotten about, his rebellion during this period. And again, a figure we'll know and have to talk about more. How Moses Fleetwood Walker was sort of written out of history, but comes back through Zirin. He also covers everything from horse racing to boxing, women's basketball, and then ultimately ends the first chapter with Theodore Roosevelt and the spokesman for muscular Christianity. And I quote, "There's a certain tendency to underestimate or overlook the need of the virile, masterful qualities of the heart and mind. There's no better way of counteracting this tendency than by encouraging bodily exercise, and especially the sports would develop such qualities as courage, resolutions, and endurance." And then he talked in a book of the value of athletic training, which was a handbook used at the turn of the 19th century. Turn into the 20th century. The masterful nations in history need to understand athletics as building courage, resolution, and endurance. Again, keeping people ready for war at any time in order to have imperial expansion. Okay, so the major proponent. The second chapter, entitled Rough Riding, and of course that is from the metaphor of the Roosevelt Rough Riders of the 1897, 1898, about the action of this group called the Rough Riders, a war machine that was created. So he titles this, and he goes into football and how football was invented and how it played out, again, in terms of the moment, if you will, of the turn of the 20th century, how football became very close, if you will, to many models that were used for work discipline as well. And he actually goes into Frederick Taylor's 4 elements of scientific management. And the principles of scientific management is the book that gave us the time clock, punching in, punching out. The 4 elements were harmony, cooperation, right, science, and maximum output. And this was called Taylorism. And then, of course, this was applied to something called teamwork, right? So I'm going to be trying to make moves, if you will, again, both here in this video, but also in the classroom, from Taylorism to teamwork. And, of course, going back to this notion of muscular Christianity and how important it is for, gearing up men for war or keeping the war machine alive. Okay, then on page 37, very important figure, and I'm going to go into him in depth, and we'll watch some some work of his. I'm going to put up actually a YouTube link for him. Paul Robeson, one of the great figures in Afro-American history and in history in the 20th century. Robeson was a double, played both offense and defense for Rutgers University, and then ultimately was a major figure in terms of becoming a lawyer and also a actor and singer professionally, and then someone who was brought before the House of Un-American Activities as being a communist, right? And he never, was quote unquote card carrying, but anyway, supported, many of the experiments around the world in terms of full employment, full health care. And he actually said the only time he really felt fully as a human being was during his visits to Russia. We'll talk more about that and the relationship to Eugene Debs. And then we're going to go on to Jack Johnson, another figure. So, Zirin has this great ability to go from the general back to the specific. So he begins with a black football player, Paul Robeson, and then he goes back in history to Jack Johnson and speaks about Jack Johnson, the boxer. And we're going to look definitely at the two schools, right? Again, this is to serve as an introduction again, just to tune you to some of the proper names and some of their thinking. The Booker T School, Washington, right? Of maybe we could call it accommodationist politics versus the W.E.B. Du Bois School of thinking about the Black condition or the race question in the United States as being one of militant activism. So we'll be speaking about this in relation to Jack Johnson, and then finishing the 1920s, if you will, is of course, or the entry into the Roaring 20s, the Black Scots scandal. Since we're in the beginning of baseball playoffs, the 1919 fixing of the World Series by the Chicago Black Sox, and of course, Shoeless Joe Jackson being one of the great figures here, right? Being excommunicated, disallowed to play baseball ever again. A lifetime 356 hitter, 375 in the playoffs. So anyway, the next chapter after that, and again, Zirin builds chronologically on sports and leisure, chapter 3. And in this chapter, he'll go through some other figures that are important, women and the whole question of the Negro League in baseball. And again, I mentioned the book, Only the Ball Was White, as a very good study of the Negro Leagues, and the Negro Leagues as being a complementary, if you will, to the Negro colleges during that time, giving people confidence, giving them proudness as things goes on. This is on page 57, 58, and then women in the 1920s. Sports then turns into a luxury because of the Great Depression, 1932. And again, I will map this out in the classroom, but I want you to be aware, again, that Zirin is very good at weaving this narrative historically, both in durational and chronological time, and at the same time, making connections to the past and also projecting these connections into the future. He's excellent at doing this. Okay, and he begins the chapter called No Depression with a study of the Jim Crow laws, also racial, discrimination. There's a lot of moments here that are similar to Harry Edwards' The Revolt of the Black Athlete. There's a very good section, paragraph or two on the Communist Party's foray into sports, something very different that you probably have never been exposed to. We're going to talk about that into the dynamics of a great figure in terms of sports writing. And I think also Zirin's kind of background role model, Lester Red Rodney. And this is very important to remember this person, Lester Red Rodney, because he was the one who basically led the initiative to get Jackie Robinson in the major leagues. Very, very interesting section. And this is on, in the book, a good solid 5 pages of 67 to 72. Very, very important. This figure, Lester Red Rodney, and I'll speak more about him as well. And then there's a section, of course, on Jesse Owens and Joe Louis and the difference between the two. One were born into poverty. Owens was a track star, but Louis, of course, was the boxer. The only schooling he really got was in the wing. So, it's very, very interesting. Conventional uplift. Owens was more inspirational that way. But, Lewis kind of represents a black man who's fighting his way out of invisibility. Very, very interesting. The invisibility versus that of the quote, black athlete that has kind of this example of uplift. So we'll speak about this, and of course, we'll look at the 1936, tape, if you will, of the Jesse Owens moment before Hitler in 1936, and then, of course, the fight at Yankee Stadium, the rematch between Joe Louis and Max Schelling, right? Very, very important, and what happened at that time. The Brown Bomber, this is the section 2, that takes us up to really the end, if you will, and also Richard Wright, the great writer, the end of chapter 4. So I'm going to leave it at that. We have a lot of work to cover. I'll try to summarize this in another YouTube commentary. Again, I want to emphasize the first 4 chapters of this book really are setting the stage. We go from, the background from the Choctaw Indians, parallel to that of King James as sports as a form of control, right, etc. The way of building an army as sports becoming muscular Christianity and training men for war. Then the whole Rough Riding section, in which some of the great figures such as Paul Robeson and Jack Johnson are mentioned. And we see the schools once again emerging at that time, the school of accommodationist politics versus that of militant politics. We'll speak to that as well. And then we'll speak also, of course, about the Depression era and the role of the role of Lester Red Rodney in getting Jackie Robinson into the major leagues and breaking the color barrier. And of course, the presence of Jesse Owens at the Olympics in 1936, what that meant in terms of what would be called conventional uplift. And then, of course, Joe Louis, known as the Brown Bomber, of which, I'm going to send you a link to a song by Paul Robeson on Joe Louis called King Joe, right? So we'll speak to that as well. So, and then we'll be picking up the next several sections too, about World War II and its discontents and sports, after the war, is it soft? What's really happening, etc. And I want us to be able to read into this work as we go through it. The film, if you will, League of Their Own, which is about women's baseball or softball, right? in the wartime period, about inequality, and what role did women play during the war through sports? What was really the gig? So we're going to speak to that as well in terms of the sociological effects. Okay, thank you very much. I'll be putting this up on YouTube, and you'll have it to view and discuss and go back to. I hope I've given you some shaping to the lecture that you'll be getting on Thursday, October the 13th. Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.